if we can begin our questions this afternoon, and I'll invite Deputy Owen Murphy to commence them, and Deputy, you have 25 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr McCarthy. You're very welcome. In your opening statement on page 11, you state that collective responsibility requires members of the government to support decisions once taken. The legitimate exercise of its democratic authority by the government must be respected by officials. You were Secretary to the Government and Secretary General of the Department of the Taoiseach from 2000 to 2011. So you were at the top of the civil service for 3 different governments and 3 different Taoiseach. So in that role, if you could just clarify, can you overrule a Taoiseach or government or act against a government's wishes?
In short, no, Deputy. I think there are certain circumstances when one would, like any public official, be required to decline to comply with a direction if it was perceived to be unlawful. And there are certain circumstances in relation to the expenditure of resources when one would be entitled to seek a written direction to be copied to the CNAG. But in general terms, overruling Taoiseach or Minister wouldn't arise, I think.
Did you ever seek such a written direction in relation to the use of financial resources?
I never had a requirement.
Okay. And you provide the Taoiseach and the government with advice. Is it safe to assume that you're across the same information that the Taoiseach is across?
Not necessarily, Deputy. I think in the formulation of policy and the furnishing of advice, the Department of the Taoiseach, through myself, would have provided a core element of information and advice, primarily in relation to the conduct of government business, in other words, preparation for Cabinet and the management of Cabinet committees, and then the particular responsibilities that the Taoiseach would discharge personally. But the Taoiseach would also be in possession of advice from other sources, including his political advisers, his ministerial colleagues outside the Cabinet framework, and obviously from other more direct personal engagements.
The information coming to the Taoiseach through the apparatus of the civil service or the departments, you would be across the same information coming through that stream?
In general, but not always.
Okay. And do you have any role in the formulation of policy?
Well, there's some aspects of policy where the Taoiseach has a direct personal role in addition to being the chair of government. And in those areas, for example, in relation to the conduct of international relations at head of government level, or the conduct of the social partnership process when that was under his aegis, then one would be making a direct contribution and giving direct advice. In other areas, it would be largely a matter of coordinating material coming from other sources. The Department of the Taoiseach isn't an analytical department. It doesn't have an extensive policy analysis function. It primarily acts to ensure that information from other departments and agencies is available and presented in the appropriate way.
And do you advise on matters of judgment?
One, at times, more in relation to process. In other words, whether an item is ripe for decision or where further engagement would be desirable.
And your ultimate responsibility is to whom? As the head of the civil service, who's your ultimate responsibility?
I wasn't the head of the civil service.
Sorry, as Secretary to the Government and Secretary General to the Department of the Taoiseach. Who are you responsible to?
To the Taoiseach.
To the Taoiseach.
Yes.
Okay. And when we talk about the responsibility of government, can we distinguish between the permanent government and the elected government?
Well, the permanent government, in the sense of officials in the civil service, then there's a very clear distinction. They are there to serve the government of the day, which has the democratic mandate to make decisions. The role of the civil service is to advise, support and implement. I think it is very conscious that is its subordinate role in terms of governance.
So when we talk about the responsibility of government, we're talking about the responsibility of the elected government?
Yes.
Okay. On the first page of your opening statement, you say, and you say this again, the conclusions of the Nyberg report give a broadly convincing account of the circumstances which led to the crisis. And on page 7 of the Nyberg report, it says the government actively supported the market over an extended period against the apparently fairly weak but clear opposition of the Department of Finance. Do you agree with this statement from Nyberg?
I think that's true, particularly in respect of the end of the 90s and the early years of the 2000s.
Were you aware of this opposition at the time?
It was expressed both in terms of formal submissions to the government from the Department of Finance and the informal discussions that would take place.
So you were?
Yes.
In every year, bar one, from 2000 to 2008, the budget package agreed by government was greater than what the Department of Finance was recommending. And were you satisfied with this outcome to the budgetary process in each of those years?
It wasn't a matter for me, Deputy, to be satisfied. I was there to ensure that the decisions were properly taken and recorded and implemented. In terms of the reasons for that outcome, I think in terms of the analysis in the Wright report, the factors are well set out as to why that would be, including the belief that the opening position from the department was that, an opening position.
But did you ever advise or caution against the increases that were being decided upon by government versus what the Department of Finance was recommending?
I would certainly have advised about the issues that they felt strongly should be taken into account.
Advising in support of those, of taking into account those issues, or?
That they should be certainly taken into account.
Okay, but then they weren't taken into account, is that correct?
I think, Deputy, one would have to say they were taken into account, but a judgment was made in the round as to what the appropriate outcome should be, and that was the prerogative of the government.
Okay. Were you ever concerned that irresponsible budgetary decisions were being taken because of a looming election?
I think one would have to be conscious that the timing of an election was in the minds of members of the government. I don't believe that one would necessarily conclude that the decisions specifically were irresponsible.
How do you explain the reversal in spending in 2002 following the general election? So at the beginning of the year, for the first 6 months, spending was 22% higher year on year, but by the end of the year it was only 14% higher. And after the election, a memo was sent by the then Minister for Finance to the departments requesting that they cut back on expenditure.
From memory, Deputy, I believe there was also a change in broad economic conditions at that time, including, if I recall, exchange rate movements, which would have had a bearing on the performance of the economy. So I'm not sure it would be safe to conclude that any change was purely a function of the electoral outcome.
Okay. How do you explain the increase in spending in the budget for 2008, given that tax receipts in 2007 were short by $2 billion?
Well, as I recall, the advice that came in respect of the outlook for economic growth was that it would still be significant, somewhat below full potential because of the rate of expected decline in the construction sector, but it was still, if I remember correctly, targeting a modest outcome in terms of the government balance.
Okay. I think revenues contracted another 14% in 2008, and all of the spending increases for 2008 were reversed in the budget for 2009.
That's certainly true, but through the course of 2008, the pace of decline in tax revenue in particular was very rapid and striking, and the forecast in, as I recall, May, was less than half the assessment provided to the government in September.
So given the $2 billion shortfall in 2007, this continuing shortfall in tax revenues wasn't anticipated into 2008 in drafting the budget?
I don't believe it was.
Okay. Were you ever concerned that the government was not using fiscal policy appropriately to manage the economy following the adoption of the euro?
I think that there was a concern about the need to ensure that the fiscal policy was appropriate given the impact of the adoption of the euro, and that there should be, on a cyclically adjusted basis, a degree of headroom to provide for any reversal that might arise. The amount of that headroom, as recommended in the June or July annual submissions by the Department of Finance, was pretty modest, and in most years was, in fact, achieved. So one would perhaps assess in retrospect that the degree of countervailing force, if you like, to be provided by fiscal policy wasn't sufficiently understood.
What was your response to the European Council censure in February 2001, which stated that they had repeatedly urged the Irish authorities to ensure economic stability by means of fiscal policy, and it regretted that this advice was not reflected in the budget for 2001, despite developments in 2000 indicating an increasing extent of overheating?
I think there were two strands of reaction to that, Deputy. On the one hand, there was, I think, acceptance that there was a case to be made in respect of the performance of fiscal policy, but there was also a sense of dissatisfaction that the terms of the censure was not either proportionate or equitable, having regard to the performance of other member states.
Let's leave that part of it aside for a moment, but the actual concern it was expressing about the management of fiscal policy. Brian Cowan said in his appearance before the committee, such conditions, and this is using fiscal policy to counter for economic stability, given that we didn't have monetary policy in our control anymore, such conditions do not appear to have received adequate attention over the period 2000 to 2006. Do you agree with that?
I think in the light of circumstances as they evolved, yes, but I think it's important to say that, as I understand it, the estimate or calculation of the cyclically adjusted balance, certainly in advance in respect of the Irish economy, is not an easy task. And in documents, in the core documents provided, there's reference to the extent of the recalculation by the IMF over the period of 7 months as to what the actual cyclical balance had been in retrospect, never mind in prospect.
But if we accept what Brian Cowan said to the inquiry, does that mean that the European Council censure in February 2001 was not given sufficient attention?
I think it was given attention in the sense that the formulation of budgetary strategy as recommended to government by Finance did emphasise the importance of securing fiscal sustainability, having regard to the risks that were in prospect. So I think it was acknowledged, but perhaps not sufficiently.
And yet, despite this, Mr. Wright concluded that Ireland failed the test of prudent fiscal management. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Did you ever feel that the budgetary process was overwhelmed by the programme for government or the social partnership process?
Mr. Wright made that observation or reached that conclusion in a particular context, which was that the process was overwhelmed. In other words, that the way in which the budget was formulated, progressed, debated and adopted didn't allow sufficient time for all of the relevant factors to be taken into account, and the pressure for expenditure arising from the programme for government and the pay terms which were established in the public service through social partnership weren't sufficiently tested, and in that respect I think he's probably right.
You were a member of the McDougall Group on the establishment of a single regulatory authority for the financial services sector. Why was your proposal for the new structure the one that was favoured by government? Charlie McCreevy called it the McCarthy compromise.
So I noticed. I can't say why it was favoured by government, but I suspect it might have been for the reasons that it seemed to me to be a possible way forward as a member of the committee. I should say that I was representing the department nominally because the department had an IFSC responsibility. At that time I had no involvement with the IFSC, so mine was a watching brief, and in the discussion it seemed to me that the desire to have a focus for accountability and engagement through a board, a statutory board which would be accountable to the Oireachtas, was important. But equally, it was important to have a clear, direct oversight from a financial stability point of view from the central bank functions. And therefore it seemed to me that a process which had a focus for accountability and operational autonomy, but overseen by a stability framework, made sense, and I suspect it did to the members of the government as well.
Did the alterations requested by the ECB, did they have a material impact on the quality of our regulation?
Arguably, they improved it from the point of view of ensuring that there was at least the potential for financial stability to provide the guiding framework for the operation of supervision and regulation.
In October 2009, in an interview in the Financial Times, Ferdy Ahern was reported as stating that the decision to create a new financial regulator was one of the main reasons for the collapse of the Irish banking sector. Do you agree with this?
No.
Do you take responsibility for the regulation, the model of regulation that was adopted?
No.
Okay. If we could move forward then, please, to 2008, into the crisis period. And actually, if we can go to the evidence book, volume 2, page 15. It'll appear on your screen if you don't have the book in front of you. This is bullet points for Cabinet on the 28th of September 2008. You see it in front of you there on the screen. Yeah. Great.
Here we go.
Were the Cabinet aware that a blanket guarantee was a possible option following the meeting of the Cabinet on the Sunday? That's right, yeah.
In answering you, Deputy, I have to be conscious of the requirements of Cabinet confidentiality, but I can say very emphatically that there was no decision in respect of any banking matter taken at that meeting.
The decision wasn't made until the Tuesday evening or the Monday evening, but it's the formula or the shape in which the guarantee was taken on, Mr. McCarthy.
Just to clarify, at no point in those bullet points, while it does use the word guarantee, it's legislate to guarantee / take control of more troubled institutions, but there's no reference to a system-wide guarantee.
It's difficult to answer your question adequately, Deputy, without indicating what the Minister said, which I'm not in a position to do.
Okay.
But what I can say is that the meeting, which was obviously about another matter, budgetary preparation, was briefed towards its conclusion by the Minister on the general situation in relation to banking difficulties and the general state of preparations to engage with them.
Maybe to assist you in answering that, Mr. McCarthy, is that we completely understand the cabinet confidentiality and so forth, but in the interim period between the one cabinet meeting and the other cabinet meeting, discussions, correspondence, other modalities may have been in play. And in respect to Deputy Murphy's question with regard to the overall shape of an overall inclusive guarantee, was that in that space at that time?
To help the committee as much as I can, Chairman, there was no decision and there was no orientation or mandate in respect of an approach arising from that government meeting.
Okay, thank you. Back to yourself.
Thank you, Chair. Did the Cabinet Ministers know on leaving that Sunday Cabinet meeting that something would be happening the next day?
Again, stretching helpfulness, I think, to the very limit. No.
Okay.
But equally, Deputy, I think it would be fair to say that they wouldn't have been surprised that something did arise.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go then to the meeting of the 29th. Did you know prior to going to the meeting that a decision on Anglo would be taken that night?
No.
Okay. At what time did you reach the meeting and at what point in the discussions?
I think I was notified that there would be such a meeting earlier in the afternoon, and I arrived at it, I think, some short time before 7 p.m.
Okay.
So I can't say for sure when the meeting started, but I suspect 6:15, 6:30, something like that.
At this point, had the possibility of a system-wide guarantee been put on the table by anyone?
Well, obviously I can't say what was said before I entered the room, but the discussion was at that point certainly dealing with the nature of the problem. In other words, what had happened during the day, the outflow of funds, and so on.
Okay. Brian Cowan was chairing the meeting, we've heard in evidence. What was your role at the meeting?
Well, my expectation in joining the meeting was that this was a briefing meeting. In other words, in the same spirit as a meeting which I had accompanied the Taoiseach to on the previous Friday, I think, in the Department of Finance. My expectation was that this was a briefing in anticipation of the scheduled government meeting the following morning. My demeanour, if you like, my expectation in arriving was that this would be a matter of hearing a briefing and to prepare what might be put to government.
Do you have an official minute or note of the meeting?
No. Other than, obviously, the record of the decision, which was my primary responsibility as it emerged.
We know that bankers who were in the building on the night drafted contemporaneous notes of what they recall had happened either the next day or in the following days. Did you draft any such note?
I didn't, Deputy. Perhaps just to explain, my primary responsibility as Secretary of the Government was what was the Government's action and what was required of it, and therefore the conduct of the incorporeal meeting, which the minutes of that obviously were presented subsequently to Government for signing and adoption as usual. What transpired the following day, of course, was that there was a series of parliamentary engagements where the reason for the decision were outlined by the Taoiseach and Minister of Finance, and there was extensive briefing and speech material prepared mainly in the Department of Finance for that. It had already been decided the previous night that the notification and submission to the European Commission on the state aid issue would be done immediately, and that all of the material which was considered during the course of the night would be reflected in that. And I saw within hours material which suggested to me that that process was indeed underway and would be comprehensive. So I didn't make a record of my own in regard to the night.
The meeting happened in the Department of the Taoiseach. Who's responsible for the meeting room, the papers left over on the table, drafts of press statements, drafts of guarantees that might have been present in the room?
In general, Deputy, where a meeting takes place in that context, it's part of the Taoiseach's private office. So his private office staff, as a matter of routine, would take up and generally destroy any documents that would be left behind by those who were at the meeting.
Did you see any documents being destroyed after the meeting?
No.
Do you feel, as the Secretary General to the Taoiseach and the Secretary to the Government, that the Taoiseach was lacking in advice from any quarter during the course of the evening?
Not lacking in advice, Deputy. He was presented, I think, with a very stark picture which built on briefings which had been provided over previous days. He had assessments which were based on judgment in the context of a very fevered international environment, and presented with the necessity to make a rapid decision, which could only be a judgment call. There was no analytical route to the right answer.
Did you know that officials from the NTMA were outside of the meeting room?
Not until late in the evening, when I learned that they were consulted by Kevin Cardiff in relation to some specific aspects of the text of the guarantee.
You said you thought you were attending a briefing ahead of a cabinet meeting the next day, and Dr. Michael Summers, when he was before us, gave the following evidence. I don't know why, if it's true, that the two main Irish banks were prepared to pony up $5 billion each for whatever period, provided they got a state guarantee. I don't know why that wasn't followed. If that is, and that, I've been told that that's what the scene was. Now, how that changed from 5 or 6 in the evening to guaranteeing everything that moved by 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I don't know. And as I say, I think it's a bad idea taking important decisions in the middle of the night. So how do we go from the possibility, or from possibly guaranteeing 10 billion to keep Anglo open until the weekend, to guaranteeing absolutely everything in the Irish banking system?
Well, in terms of the options which were considered, the idea of providing liquidity support for Anglo for a short period was certainly considered, and it was considered also in the context of the formulation of the guarantee strategy itself, that in other words there mightn't be an immediate beneficial impact of sufficient scale such that they would still need liquidity support. But it was in the context of the scale of the outflows which was reported, and very much on the explicit advice of the Governor and the financial regulator, that in taking a step which mightn't be effective, there was a real risk that one would be removing the possibility of taking a second step that would be effective. In other words, there was one shot.
You believe that there was only one shot, that you couldn't have just guaranteed the liquidity of Anglo to at least get you through to the next day?
In the light of the advices and the discussion, that's not me. It is me. My apologies, Chairman. I was sure I had. Indeed. Apologies, sir. I think in the light of the advices which were presented and the discussion, there would have been strong concern that if one moved to buy a day or two, that was money which would be burnt in the context of the immediate issue, but also that the prospect then of taking effective, decisive action would be diminished. So it wasn't seen as a viable alternative.
At any point, did you advise against an incorporeal cabinet meeting and push for a full cabinet decision in person?
No.
Okay. At any point, did you advise against the decision itself?
No. I don't think my advice was actually sought in the final run, because in a sense this was a situation where the expert opinion of the key statutory authorities was what was relevant, but it seemed to me to be a reasonable decision.
Okay. Are you satisfied now, in hindsight, that the expert opinion of the different state authorities was in the room at the time, given that we know that the NTMA was not present?
Well, I think in all of the circumstances it would have been preferable if the senior personnel from the NTMA were available and present, but their views were known and indeed voiced in terms of the discussion by Kevin Cardiff in particular.
But then, from your recollection, what were those views as expressed by Mr. Cardiff as to the view of the NTMA on the solvency of Anglo-Irish Bank and on the knowledge of the financial regulator as to what was happening in the various financial institutions?
I'm not sure that there was any view conveyed in respect of the solvency of Anglo-Irish, but there was certainly an NTMA view that nationalisation would be desirable.
And in relation to the knowledge of the financial regulator and whether or not you could trust the information that they had, if they had all the information that was needed to make that decision?
I think that I'm not sure that I recall any view in respect of the regulator being expressed either vicariously or directly by NTMA.
Okay, thank you.